The ranch appeared on the horizon like a scar that refused to fade. Elias Mercer pulled his horse to a stop at the top of the ridge and stared down at the valley he swore he'd never see again. 6 years. 6 years of drifting from one forgettable town to another, working cattle that didn't belong to him, sleeping in bunkhouses that smelled like other men's sweat and regret. 6 years of trying to outrun a memory that followed him like a shadow at noon. The county notice sat folded in his saddlebag, creased from being opened and refolded too many times. Final notice of tax delinquency. Public auction scheduled unless payment received in full. The words had burned themselves into his brain during the 3-week ride back. He told himself he was coming back to handle paperwork, sign whatever needed signing, maybe ride through one last time before strangers carved up the land and sold it piece by piece to whoever had cash and no sense of what the ground had soaked up over the years. Blood, sweat, ash. Elias nudged his horse forward, and the animal moved reluctantly, as if it could sense his hesitation. The trail down into the valley was overgrown but still visible, ruts worn deep by wagon wheels that would never roll again. He'd cut this path himself, back when his hands were younger and his chest didn't feel like it was wrapped in barbed wire every time he took a full breath. The fence line started a quarter-mile out, or what was left of it. Except, Elias frowned. The fence wasn't left. It was repaired, new posts, fresh wire strung tight and even. The kind of work that took time and muscle and someone who gave a damn whether cattle wandered or stayed put. He walked his horse along the perimeter, eyes scanning, brain trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then he smelled it. Smoke. Not the bitter, choking smoke of destruction. The warm, lazy smoke of a cook fire. Of life. His chest tightened. He rode faster. The ranch house came into view, and Elias felt the ground tilt beneath him. It was standing. The porch he'd built with his own hands, still there. The windows he'd measured and fitted, covered with actual curtains, not boards. The roof, patched, shingled, whole. And next to the house, stretching out in neat, stubborn rows, a garden. A real garden, thick with late-season vegetables, green and thriving, like the land had decided to forgive whoever worked it. Laundry hung from a line strung between 2 posts. Shirts, a dress, small clothes that looked like they belonged to a child. Elias's hand moved to the rifle in his saddle holster, then stopped. His heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't possible. He'd left this place 6 years ago in ruins. The fire had taken everything. House, barn, the small shed where he'd kept tools. He'd buried what was left of his wife and son in the cold ground behind the oak tree and rode away without looking back. There was nothing to come back to. And yet, he dismounted slowly, boots hitting dirt that had been swept clean of debris. The porch steps creaked under his weight, the same creak they'd always had, the one he'd promised to fix and never did. The front door was closed but not locked. Through the window, he could see movement inside. A woman. She was broad-shouldered, strong-looking, wearing a simple dress and an apron stained with what looked like flour. Her hair was pulled back in a braid that had come half undone. She moved around the kitchen with the kind of ease that came from knowing exactly where everything was, reaching for a pot without looking, stirring something that smelled like stew. Elias raised his hand to knock. The door swung open before his knuckles touched wood. The woman stood there, filling the doorframe, studying him with eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. She didn't smile, didn't step back, just looked at him the way a person looks at a stray dog, wary, calculating whether it's hungry enough to bite. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was low, steady, no fear in it, just the flat practicality of someone who'd learned that politeness was optional and survival wasn't. Elias opened his mouth, closed it. His brain was still trying to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. This woman, in his house, cooking in his kitchen, standing in the doorway like she had every right to be there. He stopped, swallowed. "I'm looking for a place to stay the night. Saw the smoke and thought you'd ask." She finished his sentence without inflection, like she'd heard the same story from a dozen other drifters, and didn't have the energy to care. Her eyes flicked past him to his horse, taking in the worn saddle, the thin bedroll, the way his coat hung loose on a frame that had lost weight it couldn't afford to lose. She sighed. We don't usually take in strangers, she said, but you look like you haven't eaten in 3 days, and I made too much stew. Elias blinked. We? A small face appeared behind the woman's skirt. A girl, no older than 7, with dark eyes and hair that stuck up in every direction like she'd been rolling in the dirt. She stared at Elias with the unblinking intensity of a child who hadn't yet learned that staring was rude. "That's Maisie," the woman said, "and I'm Ruth Bennett. You got a name, or should I just call you Stranger?" "Elias," he said. The lie he'd been carrying in his back pocket, the fake name, the cover story, died on his tongue. He was too tired, too thrown. Elias Mercer. Ruth's expression didn't change. The name meant nothing to her. Why would it? The ranch had been abandoned for 6 years. The county records probably listed it under the bank's name by now, waiting for auction. She had no reason to know who used to live here. No reason to know she was standing in a dead man's house. "Well, Elias Mercer," Ruth said, stepping back to let him in. "Wipe your boots. Maisie just swept." He did. Out of habit, out of shock, out of some deep, bone-tired instinct that said, when a woman offers you food and a roof, you don't ask questions. You say thank you and you eat. The inside of the house hit him like a fist to the gut. It was the same. And it wasn't. The walls were the same. The layout was the same. But everything else, furniture, curtains, the rug on the floor, was different. New, or at least newer. The table where he and Caroline used to eat breakfast was gone, replaced by a smaller, simpler one. The rocking chair by the fireplace, the one Caroline had rocked their son in every night, wasn't there. In its place sat a wooden bench with a cushion that looked hand-sewn. The ghosts were gone. Someone had swept them out and moved in. "Sit," Ruth said, nodding toward the table. "I'll get you a bowl." Elias sat. Maisie climbed onto the bench across from him and continued staring, chin resting on her folded arms. She looked like she was studying a bug, deciding whether it was interesting or just strange. "You got a horse?" Maisie said finally. "I do." "What's his name?" Elias hesitated. "Doesn't have one." Maisie frowned, deeply offended. "That's sad. Everything needs a name." "Maisie," Ruth said, setting a bowl of stew in front of Elias, "let the man eat." The stew was simple: potatoes, carrots, some kind of meat that might have been rabbit. But it was hot, and it was real, and Elias realized halfway through the first bite that he was shaking. His hands, his shoulders, like his body had finally admitted how close to empty it was running. Ruth sat down across from him with her own bowl. She didn't make conversation, just ate, steady and methodical, the way a person eats when food is fuel and nothing more. Maisie picked at hers, sneaking glances at Elias between bites. "You passing through?" Ruth asked after a while. "Something like that." "Headed where?" "Nowhere in particular." She nodded, unsurprised. "That's usually how it goes." Elias set his spoon down. "How long have you been here?" 3 years, Ruth said. "Give or take." 3 years. She'd been living on his land for 3 years, and he'd had no idea. No one had told him. Not that anyone knew where he was. He'd made sure of that. "You own the place?" he asked, careful, testing. Ruth snorted. "No, it's abandoned, or it was. County doesn't care as long as someone keeps it from falling apart." She paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "Why? You looking to buy?" "Just curious." "Uh-huh." She didn't believe him, but she didn't push. Just went back to her stew. A loud, aggressive bleat came from somewhere outside. Maisie's head snapped up. "That's Jericho," she said, scrambling off the bench. "He wants dinner." "Jericho," Elias said. "Our ram," Ruth said, standing to follow her daughter. Well, you'll see." Elias followed them out onto the porch, because the alternative was sitting alone in a house full of someone else's things, and that felt worse than facing whatever a ram named Jericho turned out to be. What Jericho turned out to be was enormous. The ram stood in the yard like a woolly boulder, head lowered, yellow eyes fixed on Elias with the kind of hostility usually reserved for predators. His horns curved back in thick, brutal spirals. He bleated again, louder, and pawed the ground. "He doesn't like strangers," Maisie said cheerfully. "Mama says he's protective." "Mama says he's a menace," Ruth corrected, hauling a bucket of feed toward the ram. But he keeps coyotes off the property, so we tolerate him. Jericho took the feed without breaking eye contact with Elias. The message was clear. I'm watching you. Elias almost smiled. Almost. They stood there in the fading light, Ruth and Maisie and the hostile ram. And Elias felt something crack open inside his chest, something old and rusted shut. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to ride in, find ruins, handle the county paperwork, and leave. Clean, simple, no complications. Instead, he found a woman who'd rebuilt his ranch with her bare hands, a little girl who named everything, a ram who looked like it wanted to headbutt him into next week. He found life, and he had no idea what to do with it. Ruth offered him the barn for the night. It's warm enough, she said, and there's hay, better than sleeping in the dirt. Elias nodded. He didn't argue. Didn't mention that he'd slept in worse places, or that the barn used to house horses that were long dead, or that every corner of this property held memories sharp enough to draw blood. He just said, "Thank you." Ruth studied him for a moment, the same way she'd studied him at the door, like she was adding up details and coming to a conclusion she didn't entirely trust. "You can stay for breakfast," she said finally. "After that, you're on your own." "Fair enough." She turned to go, then stopped. "Elias?" "Yeah?" "Don't steal anything." He blinked. "I won't." "Good, because if you do, Jericho will know, and he doesn't forgive." Maisie giggled from the porch. Jericho bleated in agreement. Ruth didn't smile, but something in her eyes softened. Just a fraction, just enough. Then she was gone, back into the house, and Elias was alone in the yard with a ram that hated him and a past that refused to stay buried. He led his horse into the barn, unsaddled it, brushed it down. The motions were automatic, familiar, the kind of work that didn't require thought, which was good, because his thoughts were a tangled mess. The barn smelled like hay and leather, and something else, something clean. Ruth had been here too, swept the floors, organized the tools, fixed the broken stall door that he'd never gotten around to fixing. She'd done everything. Elias spread out his bedroll in the corner and lay down, staring up at the rafters. The same rafters he used to stare at when he was a younger man with a wife and a son and a future that felt solid. He closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come. Morning arrived cold and gray. Elias woke to the sound of chickens and the distant clang of a water pump. He rolled up his bedroll, splashed water on his face from the trough, and walked toward the house. Ruth was already outside, hanging more laundry. She worked quickly, efficiently, pinning shirts to the line with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. Maisie sat on the porch steps, talking to Jericho, who lay in the dirt like a sphinx. "You're up," Ruth said without turning around. "Didn't want to miss breakfast." "Smart man." Inside, the kitchen smelled like coffee and cornbread. Ruth set a plate in front of him, eggs, bread, a slice of bacon that looked like it had been rationed carefully. Maisie climbed into her seat and immediately launched into a story about a bird she'd seen yesterday that might have been a hawk, or might have been a very large sparrow. She wasn't sure. Elias ate, listened, tried not to look at the corner where Caroline's rocking chair used to be. "So," Ruth said, pouring herself coffee, "where are you headed after this?" Elias hesitated. The truth sat heavy in his mouth. "Nowhere. I'm here to pay the taxes and figure out what to do with the land. This land, your land, my land." "Town," he said instead. "Need to handle some business." "What kind of business?" "The boring kind." Ruth smirked. "Most business is." Maisie tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, can he stay longer? His horse still doesn't have a name." "His horse is fine, Maisie." "But, Maisie." The little girl deflated but didn't argue further. Ruth softened, reaching over to ruffle her daughter's hair. The gesture was quick, almost absent, but Elias saw the love in it, the kind of love that didn't need words. He wondered if Caroline had looked at their son that way. He couldn't remember anymore. The memories were fading, blurred at the edges like old photographs left too long in the sun. "I should get going," Elias said, standing abruptly. The chair scraped against the floor. "Thank you for the food. And the barn." Ruth nodded. "Safe travels." He turned to leave, and his horse went lame. But it happened fast. One moment Elias was saddling up, checking the stirrups, preparing to ride out. The next, his horse was favoring its front left leg, head down, ears back. Elias crouched, ran his hand down the leg, and found the problem immediately. Horseshoe half torn, nail bent at an ugly angle. The kind of thing that happened when you rode too hard over rough ground and didn't check carefully enough. "Damn," he muttered. "Problem?" Ruth appeared beside him, arms crossed. "Threw a shoe, needs a farrier." "Closest one's in town. Won't be out here until next week." Elias stood, jaw tight. "Next week. Unless you want to ride him lame and cripple him for good." Ruth's tone was flat, practical. "Your choice." It wasn't a choice. He knew that. She knew that. "I can help with work," Elias said. "Pay for the trouble." Ruth considered this. "Fence line needs mending on the south pasture, and the roof's got a leak I can't reach." "I can do that. Then I guess you're staying." Maisie, listening from the porch, let out a whoop of victory. Jericho bleated, though whether in approval or protest was unclear. Elias looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back, expression unreadable. "1 week," she said. "1 week," he agreed. And just like that, the lie he'd been holding on to, "I'll leave in the morning, handle this clean, no complications," collapsed. He was staying in his own house with a woman who didn't know his name meant anything, and every day he stayed, the truth got heavier. The work started immediately. Ruth didn't believe in wasted daylight. By mid-morning, Elias was on the south fence line with a post hammer and a bag of nails, Maisie trailing behind him asking questions. "Why'd you leave your last job?" "Didn't like it." "Why not?" "Just didn't." "But why?" "Maisie," Ruth called from the garden, "let the man work." Maisie sighed dramatically, but obeyed, flopping down in the grass to watch. Jericho wandered over and lay beside her, still glaring at Elias with profound suspicion. The fence was in worse shape than it looked from a distance. Posts rotted through, wire sagging. But someone, Ruth obviously, had done a decent job with what she had. The repairs were rough, but functional. The work of someone who learned by doing and didn't have the luxury of mistakes. Elias worked through the afternoon, replacing posts, re-stringing wire. His hands remembered the rhythm. His body remembered the ache. For the first time in 6 years, he felt useful. Ruth came by near sunset, carrying a water jug. "You're faster than I thought," she said, surveying the completed section. "Had practice." "Ranching." Something like that. She handed him the jug. He drank, the water cold and clean, tasting like it came from a deep well. His well. The one he'd dug the second year he and Caroline were married, back when they still believed hard work and hope were enough. "You do good work," Ruth said. "Better than most drifters." "Thanks." "Don't let it go to your head." He almost smiled. They walked back toward the house together, Maisie and Jericho trailing behind. The sun was sinking, painting the valley gold and red, the kind of sunset that used to make Caroline stop whatever she was doing just to watch. Elias's chest tightened. "You okay?" Ruth asked. "Fine." She didn't push, just kept walking. That night, after dinner, Elias lay in the barn and stared at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Ruth and Maisie were asleep. The only sound was the wind and the occasional bleat from Jericho, who apparently stood guard, even at night. Elias thought about the county notice in his saddlebag, thought about the auction, thought about the woman in his house who'd done something he couldn't. She'd made the land live again. And he thought about the choice he was going to have to make. Tell her the truth and watch her world collapse, or keep lying and lose the last shred of himself he had left. Neither option felt like winning. Must see. The days blurred together, fence work, roof work, hauling water, chopping wood, the kind of labor that left Elias too tired to think and too sore to sleep well. Ruth worked beside him most days, matching him pace for pace, never complaining, never slowing. She was stronger than she looked, tougher than most men he'd worked with. Maisie helped in her own way, fetching tools, chattering endlessly, giving Jericho updates on their progress like the ram was a foreman. "Jericho says you're doing good," she announced one afternoon. "Does he?" Elias said. "Yes, but he also says you still can't be trusted." "Fair," Ruth snorted from the roof where she was hammering down shingles. At least he's honest. Elias handed up another shingle. How long have you had him? Jericho, since Maisie was 4. Traded a bag of cornmeal for him. Owner said he was too mean to keep. And you thought that sounded like a good deal? I thought it sounded like he'd keep predators away. And he does. He also keeps everyone else away. That too. There was a pause. Then Ruth said, quieter, sometimes that's not a bad thing. Elias looked up at her. She was focused on the shingles, face shadowed by the brim of her hat. But something in her voice told him there was a story there. A reason she'd ended up on an abandoned ranch in the middle of nowhere with a little girl and a hostile ram. He didn't ask. People carried their ghosts the way they carried scars. You didn't poke at them unless you wanted to bleed too. Back. It was Maisie who broke the fragile equilibrium. She found it in the garden, half buried near the tomato plants, dirt-caked but unmistakable. A locket. Gold, tarnished with a delicate floral pattern etched into the surface. Elias was hauling wood when Maisie came running, face lit up with the excitement of discovery. Look what I found! She held it up, and the world stopped. Elias knew that locket. He'd given it to Caroline on their first anniversary. She'd worn it every day after, tucked under her collar, close to her heart. Inside was a picture of the two of them, young and stupid and smiling like they'd live forever. It had burned with her, or so he'd thought. Mama says I can keep it, Maisie said, oblivious. She's going to clean it up, and I can wear it. And where did you find that? Elias's voice came out wrong, too sharp, too raw. Maisie blinked, startled. In the garden, by the tomatoes. Why? Ruth appeared from the house, alerted by the tone. What's going on? Elias couldn't speak, couldn't move. He just stared at the locket in Maisie's small, dirty hand. Ruth's eyes flicked between them. Maisie, go inside. But inside, now. Maisie obeyed, confused and a little scared. Ruth waited until the door closed, then turned to Elias. You want to tell me what that was about? Elias forced himself to breathe. The locket, how? Maisie digs in the garden, finds things sometimes. Buttons, nails, pieces of old metal. I figured it belonged to whoever lived here before. It did. Ruth went very still. You knew them? Elias looked at her, at this woman who'd taken his dead wife's locket and given it to her daughter without knowing, without meaning harm, just trying to make a little girl smile. He should tell her, right now, the truth, all of it. Instead, he said, I knew the family, long time ago. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Ruth studied him, and for a moment, Elias thought she was going to push, demand answers, call him out, but she didn't. I'll talk to Maisie, she said quietly. If it's important, she can give it back. No. The word came out too fast. Let her keep it. You sure? He nodded, not trusting his voice. Ruth hesitated, then turned toward the house. At the door, she paused. Elias? Yeah? If you're running from something, that's your business. But if it's going to blow back on me and Maisie, I need to know. It won't. Another lie. Another weight added to the pile. Ruth nodded and went inside. Elias stood alone in the yard, fists clenched, heart hammering. Jericho appeared from around the side of the house and bleated, low and accusing. I know, Elias muttered. I know. That night, he couldn't stay in the barn. He walked instead. Out past the fence line, into the hills, under a sky so thick with stars it felt like drowning. He walked until his legs ached and his lungs burned, and then he kept walking. Eventually, he found it. The oak tree. Thick, ancient, standing alone on a ridge overlooking the valley. And beneath it, 2 graves. Simple wooden crosses, weathered gray, names carved by his own hand. Caroline Mercer, beloved wife. Samuel Mercer, beloved son. Elias dropped to his knees in the dirt. He hadn't cried in 6 years, hadn't let himself. Crying meant stopping, and stopping meant feeling, and feeling meant remembering, and remembering meant breaking. But the locket had cracked something open, and now he couldn't hold it back. He cried, ugly, choking sobs that tore out of his chest like they'd been buried there since the fire. He cried for Caroline, who'd died trying to save their son, for Samuel, who never got the chance to grow up, for the life they were supposed to have and the man he was supposed to be. He cried until there was nothing left. Then he sat back, wiped his face, and stared at the crosses. "I don't know what to do," he said out loud. "There's a woman down there, a little girl. They're living in our house, Caroline, and they don't know. They think it's just some abandoned place they found." The wind rustled through the oak leaves. No answer, just wind. "She's strong," Elias continued, "stronger than me. She rebuilt everything. And the kid, Maisie, she's got your stubbornness. Talks to a damn ram like it's a person." He laughed, bitter and broken. "They're good people, and I'm lying to them. Every day I stay, I'm lying." Silence. "I came back to save the land," he said. "That's what I told myself. But I think maybe I just wanted to see if anything was left worth saving." The graves didn't answer. They never did. Elias stood, his knees cracked, his back ached. He felt 100 years old. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for leaving, for not being strong enough to stay." Then he turned and walked back down the hill, toward the house with smoke curling from the chimney, toward the woman who didn't know his name, toward the choice he still didn't know how to make. Behind him, the oak tree stood silent, keeping watch over the dead, while the living stumbled forward, carrying ghosts they couldn't bury and truths they couldn't speak. The farrier didn't come. 7 days turned into 8, then 9. Each morning, Elias told himself he'd saddle up and ride into town anyway, lame horse or not. And each morning, something stopped him. A section of fence that needed finishing, a loose board on the porch. Ruth mentioning casually that the water pump was acting strange, and maybe he could take a look before he left. He took the look, fixed the pump, started on the fence, and stayed another day. The routine settled over him like dust. Wake before dawn, coffee that Ruth made strong enough to strip paint, work until his shoulders screamed, dinner at the table with Maisie chattering and Jericho bleeding outside like he was part of the conversation. Then back to the barn, where sleep came easier than it had in years. He was good at not thinking about what came next. 6 years of drifting had taught him that much, but Ruth was watching him. He could feel it. She didn't say anything directly, just studied him when she thought he wasn't looking, the same way she'd studied him that first day on the porch, like she was trying to fit together pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite match. On the 10th day, she finally asked. They were in the garden, pulling weeds. Maisie was supposed to be helping, but had wandered off to have what sounded like a very serious conversation with Jericho about responsibility. "You ever going to tell me why you're really here?" Ruth said. Elias kept pulling weeds. "Told you, passing through." "For 10 days. Farrier hasn't come." "Farrier came yesterday, left word with Maisie, said he could shoe your horse this afternoon if you brought him in." Elias's hand stilled. "Maisie didn't mention it." "I told her not to." He looked up. Ruth was watching him with those steady, unreadable eyes. "Why?" he said. She sat back on her heels, wiping dirt from her hands. "Because I wanted to see if you'd leave on your own, or if you needed a push." And you're still here. So either you've got nowhere to go, or you're avoiding something. Maybe both. She paused. "I don't care which. But if you're staying longer, I need to know whether I can count on you or if you're going to disappear the second things get hard." It was the most direct she'd been since he arrived. No politeness, no dancing around the subject, just the plain truth laid out between them like cards on a table. Elias considered lying, considered packing up right then and riding out before this got any more complicated. Instead, he said, "I can stay another week, maybe 2, if you need the help." Ruth studied him. "What happens after 2 weeks? I have business in town, can't avoid it forever." "What kind of business?" "The kind that'll keep me there a while." She nodded slowly, not satisfied, but accepting. "All right, 2 weeks. Then you handle your business, and I'll figure out the rest." "Fair enough." They went back to weeding. The conversation was over, but something had shifted. A line had been drawn. Not in anger, but in clarity. Ruth wasn't the kind of woman who let people drift in and out of her life without knowing what they wanted. She'd been burned before. Elias could see it in the way she held herself, guarded, self-sufficient, ready for the next blow. He wondered who'd taught her that, and whether they'd regretted it. That afternoon, he took his horse into town. The farrier was a grizzled man named Dutch, who worked out of a shed behind the livery. He looked at the thrown shoe, grunted, and set to work without asking questions. Elias appreciated that. Too many people in small towns wanted your life story before they'd hand you a nail. While Dutch worked, Elias walked the main street. The town was bigger than he remembered. New buildings, new people. The old general store was still there, but it had a fresh coat of paint and a sign that said, "Under new management." Everything changes, even the things you think are permanent. He stopped at the land office. A clerk with ink-stained fingers and a bored expression looked up from a ledger. "Help you?" "I need information on a property," Elias said. "Out past the ridge. Used to be the Mercer Ranch." The clerk flipped through a file box, pulled out a folder. "Mercer, right. Delinquent taxes. Scheduled for auction in, He squinted at the paper. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Elias's chest tightened. "How much to clear the debt?" The clerk ran a finger down a column of numbers. $140 plus fees. Call it $160 total. $160. 6 years of back taxes and penalties. It might as well have been $1,000. Elias had maybe $30 in his pocket. The rest of his savings, what little he'd managed to scrape together from ranch work, was tied up in a bank 2 towns over. He could get it. But it would take time. And time was the one thing he didn't have if he wanted to beat the auction. "Can I make a partial payment?" he asked. The clerk shrugged. "Doesn't stop the auction, but it shows good faith. Might convince the county to extend the deadline if you can prove you're working on it." "How do I prove that?" "Bring in whatever you've got. Sign an affidavit saying you intend to pay in full. We'll file it. After that, it's up to the county treasurer." He gave Elias a long look. "You the owner?" "Yeah." "Then you better move fast. Property's been abandoned a long time. Assessor says someone's been squatting there. If you don't claim it soon, county might just let them have it." Elias felt his jaw tighten. "They can't do that." "They can if the owner doesn't care enough to show up." The clerk closed the folder. "You got 3 weeks, Mr. Mercer. After that, it's out of your hands." Elias left the land office with his thoughts churning. 3 weeks, $160. And Ruth, back at the ranch, tending a garden on land that was about to be ripped out from under her. He should tell her. Right now. Ride back, sit her down, explain everything. But if he did that, what would she do? Pack up Maisie and leave? Fight him for the land she'd rebuilt? Hate him for letting her believe it was hers? None of those options felt like something he could survive. So he did what he'd been doing for 6 years. He didn't decide. He just kept moving. Dutch finished the shoe. Elias paid him, mounted up, and rode back toward the ranch. The sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of orange and purple. From the ridge, he could see smoke rising from the chimney, laundry still on the line. The garden a dark green patch against the pale dirt. It looked like home, and that was the problem. When Elias rode into the yard, Maisie was waiting on the porch. She jumped up, waving. "Did Dutch fix your horse?" "He did. Does that mean you're leaving?" Elias dismounted. "Not yet." Maisie grinned. "Good. Mama made pie." Inside, Ruth was pulling a pie out of the oven. Apple, from the smell of it. She glanced at Elias as he came through the door. "Horse all right?" "Good as new." "Then I guess you'll be moving on soon." It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact. Elias hesitated. "I told you, 2 weeks." Ruth set the pie on the table. "You did, but people say a lot of things. I'm not people." "No," she said quietly. "I'm starting to think you're not." They ate dinner in silence. Biscuits, beans, slices of the pie that was still too hot and burned the roof of Elias's mouth. Maisie filled the quiet with a story about how Jericho had chased off a coyote that morning, which may or may not have actually happened, but made for good telling either way. After Maisie went to bed, Ruth and Elias sat on the porch. The night was cool, the stars sharp and bright. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Jericho answered with a defiant bleat. "She really loves that ram," Elias said. "She loves anything that doesn't leave," Ruth said. Then softer. Can't blame her for that. Elias looked over. Ruth was staring out at the dark valley, arms wrapped around herself like she was cold, even though the night was mild. Her father? Elias asked. Ruth didn't answer right away. Then, he left before she was born. Didn't want the responsibility. Or me. Or any of it. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I thought I could change his mind, thought if I just tried harder, loved him better, he'd stay. But he didn't. No, he didn't. They sat with that for a while. My brother-in-law thinks I'm a fool, Ruth said eventually. Says I should have remarried, found someone to take care of us, but I didn't want someone to take care of us. I wanted to take care of us myself. So you did. So I did. She turned to look at him. You think that's stubborn? I think it's brave. Ruth snorted. Brave, right. Most people just call it pride. Maybe pride's just another word for not giving up. She studied him in the dim light. You ever been married, Elias? The question hit like a punch. He should have expected it, should have had an answer ready, but all he could see was Caroline laughing in the kitchen, Samuel chasing chickens in the yard. Once, he said. What happened? She died. Ruth went very still. I'm sorry. Elias shook his head. It was a long time ago. Doesn't make it easier. No, it doesn't. They didn't talk after that. Just sat in the quiet, two people carrying weight they couldn't put down. Eventually, Ruth stood. I'm going to bed. You need anything? I'm fine. She nodded and went inside. Elias stayed on the porch until the cold drove him to the barn. He lay in his bedroll, staring at the rafters, thinking about the land office, the auction, the $160 he didn't have, and Ruth, who'd rebuilt this place with nothing but stubbornness and hope. He couldn't let her lose it, but he couldn't give it to her either, not without telling her the truth, and the truth would destroy everything. The next morning, Ruth's friend arrived. Her name was Clara, and she rode up in a wagon with a crate of chickens and a personality loud enough to wake the dead. She was thin, sharp-featured, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and eyes that missed nothing. Ruth Bennett, she called, climbing down from the wagon. You didn't tell me you had a man around. Ruth came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. He's not my man, Clara. He's helping with repairs. Uh-huh. Clara looked Elias up and down like she was evaluating livestock. What's your name, son? Elias Mercer. Something flickered across Clara's face. Mercer. That name sounds familiar. Elias's stomach dropped. Common name. Maybe. But she was still watching him, eyes narrowed. Ruth took the crate of chickens. What brings you out here? Can't a woman visit a friend? Clara followed Ruth toward the coop. Besides, I heard things in town. Wanted to make sure you knew. Knew what? Clara glanced at Elias, then back at Ruth. Maybe we should talk inside. Ruth frowned. Clara, if you've got something to say, just say it. Clara sighed. Fine. The Mercer Ranch is going up for auction. 3 weeks. County's finally done waiting for the owner to come back. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. Ruth's expression didn't change. So this is the Mercer Ranch, Ruth. You're living on it. I know that. Then you know what happens when it sells. Whoever buys it will have to deal with me, Ruth said flatly. I've been here 3 years, Clara. I've paid for repairs out of my own pocket. I've made this land productive again. Any judge with half a brain would see that. Clara's face softened. Honey, judges don't care about fairness. They care about paperwork. And the paperwork says this land belongs to Elias Mercer. She paused. Or his estate, if he's dead. Which he might be, for all anyone knows. Ruth set the chicken crate down hard. Then I'll buy it at auction. With what money? I'll find it. Ruth, I'll find it, Clara. Clara looked like she wanted to argue, but didn't. She just sighed and squeezed Ruth's arm. All right, but if you need help, you ask. You hear me? Ruth nodded. Clara climbed back into her wagon, gave Elias one last suspicious look, and drove off. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elias stood frozen, waiting for Ruth to turn around, to demand answers, to put the pieces together. But she didn't turn around. She just picked up the chicken crate and carried it to the coop, shoulders squared, face set. Maisie came running from the barn. "Mama, can I help with the chickens?" "Yes, baby. Go ahead." Maisie darted past, oblivious. Ruth finally looked at Elias. "You knew," she said. It wasn't a question. Elias opened his mouth, closed it. "You knew," Ruth said again, louder. "That's why you asked about ownership. That's why you've been acting strange. You knew this whole time." "Ruth, how long?" "Since the beginning." Her face went pale. "Since the beginning. You've been here almost 2 weeks, and you knew?" She stopped, took a breath. "Who are you?" This was it, the moment he'd been dreading since he rode in. "I'm Elias Mercer," he said quietly. "I own this ranch." The words hung in the air like smoke. Ruth stared at him. "You're lying." "I'm not." "The owner's been gone for 6 years. Everyone says, everyone's right. I left 6 years ago, after the fire." "What fire?" Elias forced himself to meet her eyes. "The one that killed my wife and son." Ruth took a step back, like she'd been shoved. Her hand went to her throat. "No. I'm sorry." "No." Her voice was shaking now. "You let me. You sat at my table. You ate my food. You slept in my barn. And the whole time you knew. I didn't know how to tell you. You didn't try." Maisie appeared in the doorway of the coop, alarmed. "Mama?" Ruth's jaw clenched. She looked at her daughter, then back at Elias. When she spoke again, her voice was cold, controlled. "Get off my property." "Ruth, please. It's not your property." The words came out strangled. "You left it. You abandoned it. I'm the one who made it live again. Me, not you." "I know." "Then why are you here? To take it back? To throw us out?" "No, I came to pay the taxes. To keep it from going to auction." Ruth laughed, bitter and broken. "How noble. The ghost rides in to save the day." "I didn't mean for this to happen." "What did you mean, Elias? What was the plan? Let me keep working myself to the bone on land that was never mine? Let Maisie think she had a home? And then what? Show up one day with the deed and tell us to leave?" "I don't want you to leave." "Then what do you want?" The question hung between them. Elias didn't have an answer. He'd spent 6 years running. 6 years not wanting anything except to forget. And now standing in front of this woman who'd done what he couldn't, rebuild, survive, live. He didn't know how to explain that he'd come back to bury the past and found something that made him want a future. "I want to help," he said finally. Ruth shook her head. "I don't need your help. I need you gone." "Mama?" Maisie's voice was small, scared. Ruth's expression cracked. She crouched down, pulled Maisie close. "It's okay, baby. Go inside." "But inside. Now." Maisie obeyed, casting one last confused look at Elias before disappearing into the house. Ruth stood. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "You've got until morning, then I don't want to see you again." "Ruth, I mean it, Elias, or Mercer, or whoever the hell you are. You leave, or I will." She turned and walked into the house, slamming the door behind her. Elias stood alone in the yard. Jericho appeared from around the corner and bleated, low, accusing, victorious. "Yeah," Elias muttered. "You were right about me." He walked to the barn, packed his bedroll, saddled his horse. His hands were shaking. His chest felt like it was caving in. He'd known this would happen. Known the truth would break everything, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. He led his horse out of the barn. The house was dark except for one window, Ruth's room. He could see her shadow moving inside, pacing. He should leave. Right now. Ride into town, pay the taxes, sign whatever paperwork would keep the ranch from auction, and disappear again. Let Ruth have the land. Let her raise Maisie here. Let them build the life they deserved. It was the right thing to do. But as Elias swung into the saddle, something stopped him. A memory. Caroline's voice, the last thing she'd said to him before the fire. "Don't let fear make you a coward, Elias. Fight for what matters." He'd failed her then. Run instead of fighting. Let grief turn him into a ghost. But Ruth wasn't Caroline, and Maisie wasn't Samuel, and this time running wouldn't save anyone. Elias dismounted, tied his horse to the post, walked to the porch, and sat down. He wasn't leaving, not yet. Inside, Ruth saw him through the window. He could feel her watching, but she didn't come out, and he didn't knock. They just stayed there, separated by a door and a truth too heavy to carry alone. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind of morning that felt like the sky couldn't decide whether to rain or just stay miserable. Elias woke on the porch with his back screaming and his neck stiff as a board. He'd fallen asleep sitting up, head tilted against the post, and now every joint in his body was protesting the decision. The door opened. Ruth stood there with a cup of coffee in each hand. She looked like she hadn't slept either. Eyes red-rimmed, hair falling loose from its braid, the same dress she'd worn yesterday, now wrinkled. She held out one of the cups. Elias took it, surprised. "I thought you wanted me gone." "I do," Ruth said, "but I also don't waste coffee." She sat down on the opposite end of the porch, as far from him as she could get without leaving entirely. They drank in silence, watching the valley wake up. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. Jericho bleated his morning complaint. "Maisie asked about you," Ruth said finally. "What'd you tell her?" "That you had business in town, that you'd be leaving soon." She stared into her cup. "I didn't tell her the rest. Didn't know how." Elias nodded. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Sorry for lying, or sorry you got caught?" "Both, neither, I don't know." He set the cup down. "I didn't come here to hurt you, Ruth." "But you did anyway." "Yeah, I did." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me about the fire." Elias felt his chest tighten. "Why?" "Because if you're going to take this place from me, I want to know what you're taking it back for. The land, the house, or just the ghosts?" It was a fair question, brutal, but fair. Elias leaned back against the post, eyes fixed on the horizon. It was winter, late. We'd had a cold snap that froze the well, so I was hauling water from the creek. Caroline was inside with Samuel, our son. He was 3. Ruth didn't say anything, just waited. "I don't know how it started," Elias continued. "Maybe a spark from the fireplace, maybe a lantern tipped over. By the time I saw the smoke, the whole back of the house was burning. I tried to get to them, but the door was jammed. The heat—" He stopped, swallowed. I could hear them screaming, Caroline, Samuel, and I couldn't get to them. His hands were shaking. He gripped the edge of the porch to steady them. By the time I broke through, it was too late. Caroline had tried to get Samuel out through the window, but the smoke— She collapsed before she made it. I pulled them both out, but they were already gone. Ruth's face had gone pale. Jesus. I buried them under the oak tree. Then I left. Didn't even look back. Just rode until I couldn't hear the fire anymore. He laughed, hollow. Turns out you can ride a long way and still hear it. That's why you didn't come back. That's why I didn't come back. They sat with that. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the yard. Inside, Maisie was awake. Elias could hear her talking to herself, or maybe to the locket she'd found, the one that used to belong to Caroline. "I don't want to take the land from you," Elias said quietly. "I came back to save it from the auction. That's the truth. I figured I'd pay the taxes, sign it over to the county, let them sell it to someone who'd use it. But then I saw what you did here, how you rebuilt it, and I—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "I didn't know what to do." Ruth looked at him. "You still don't." "No, I don't." She stood, brushing off her dress. "Well, you've got 3 weeks to figure it out. After that, the county decides for both of us." "Ruth, I'm not leaving, Elias. I don't care whose name is on the deed. I built this place back up from nothing. Maisie has a home here. We're not going anywhere." There was steel in her voice, the same steel that had kept her alive through winters and hardship and whatever else she'd survived to get here. Elias believed her. "Then we need a plan," he said. Ruth frowned. "We? You can't buy it at auction. You don't have the money. And even if you did, there's no guarantee you'd be the highest bidder. So what do you suggest? I pay the taxes, clear the debt, keep it out of auction. And then what? You own it, and I'm still squatting? Then we figure out something that works for both of us." Ruth crossed her arms. "Like what?" Elias didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. But he could see the gears turning in Ruth's mind, weighing options, calculating risks. Finally, she said, "I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking." She turned to go inside, then paused. "For the record, I still don't trust you." "I know. But you can stay, for now, until we sort this out." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Elias nodded. "Thank you." Ruth disappeared into the house. A moment later, Maisie burst out, still in her nightgown, hair sticking up in every direction. "You're still here," she said, grinning. "I am. Mama said you had business." "I do, but it can wait." Maisie climbed onto the porch railing, balancing like a tightrope walker. "Jericho missed you." "Did he?" "Uh-huh. He told me." "What else did he tell you?" "That you're sad, and that you need to smile more." She demonstrated, stretching her mouth into an exaggerated grin. Elias felt something crack inside his chest. Not breaking, just opening. He smiled, small but real. Maisie clapped. "See? That's better." Over the next few days, an uneasy truce settled over the ranch. Ruth didn't warm to Elias, but she stopped glaring daggers every time he walked into a room. They worked side by side, fixing the chicken coop, replanting sections of the garden where the soil had gone bad, reinforcing the barn doors against the wind. They didn't talk much. When they did, it was practical, functional. But there was a rhythm to it, a cadence that felt almost comfortable. Maisie, oblivious to the tension, treated Elias like he'd always been there. She dragged him around the property, showing him her favorite hiding spots, introducing him to each chicken by name, giving him a full briefing on Jericho's personality. "He's grumpy in the mornings," she explained seriously. "But if you give him an apple, he's nice, mostly." "Good to know. Also, he doesn't like hats. Mama says it's because he's vain." Elias glanced at the ram, who was watching them from across the yard with his usual suspicion. "I'll keep that in mind." One afternoon, while Ruth was in town trading eggs for supplies, Elias and Maisie sat on the porch shelling peas. Maisie worked with intense concentration, tongue sticking out between her teeth. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Are you going to stay forever?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't know, Maisie. Mama says people always leave." Elias looked down at the little girl beside him. She wasn't looking at him, just kept shelling peas, but her hands had slowed. "Did she say why?" he asked gently. Maisie shrugged. "She says it's because we're not worth staying for." The words hit like a punch. Elias set down the bowl. "Maisie, look at me." She did, those dark eyes wide and serious. "That's not true," Elias said. "You and your mama are worth everything. You hear me? Anyone who left you didn't leave because you weren't enough. They left because they were too scared to stay." Maisie considered this. "Were you scared?" "Yeah, I was." "Are you still scared?" Elias thought about it, about the ranch, the ghosts, the way his chest tightened every time he walked past the spot where the house had burned. "A little," he admitted, "but I'm trying not to be." Maisie nodded, satisfied. "Good, because Mama needs help, and Jericho's getting old, and I can't do everything myself." She went back to shelling peas, and Elias sat there wondering how a 7-year-old had just become the wisest person he'd ever met. When Ruth came back from town, she was quiet, distracted. She unloaded the wagon without meeting Elias's eyes, then disappeared into the house. Elias found her later, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a piece of paper. "What's wrong?" he asked. Ruth didn't answer right away. Then she slid the paper across the table. It was a notice. Official county letterhead. Notice of claim contest. Ruth Bennett versus estate of Elias Mercer. "What is this?" Elias said. "Clara helped me file it. It's a claim of adverse possession. Basically, I'm arguing that because I've lived here for 3 years, maintained the property, and made improvements, I have a legal right to it." Elias stared at the paper. "Ruth, I know what you're going to say. That it won't work. That the law's on your side. But I have to try, Elias. I can't just sit here and wait for you to decide what happens to us. I'm not deciding anything without you." "Aren't you?" Ruth's voice was sharp. "You own the land. You hold all the cards. I'm just—" She stopped, jaw tight. "I'm just hoping you're a better man than the ones who came before you." The words stung. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," Elias said. Then what are you trying to do? I don't know. The frustration boiled over. I don't know, Ruth. I came here thinking I'd handle some paperwork and leave. But then I met you and Maisie, and I saw what you built, and everything got... He stopped, took a breath. Complicated. Ruth leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. Life's complicated, Elias. You don't get to run from it forever. I'm not running. Then what do you call the last 6 years? He didn't have an answer for that. Ruth stood. The hearing's in 2 weeks. County judge will decide whether my claim has merit. If it does, we go to trial. If it doesn't... She didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. And if I withdraw my claim, Elias said, just sign the land over to you? Ruth's expression shifted, something between hope and suspicion. Would you do that? I don't know. Maybe. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen, the table between them like a border neither could cross. Finally, Ruth said, I'm going to bed. Lock the door when you go to the barn. She left. Elias sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the notice, trying to figure out how everything had gotten so tangled. The next morning, Wade Bennett arrived. Elias was fixing a section of fence when he heard the horse. He looked up to see a man riding toward the ranch, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face like a clenched fist and eyes that scanned the property like he was taking inventory. Ruth stepped out onto the porch, and Elias saw her whole body go rigid. Wade, she said. Flat, cold. Wade dismounted, ignoring Elias entirely. Ruth, heard you've been busy. What do you want? Can I visit family? We're not family. Maisie's my blood. That makes us family. Ruth's jaw tightened. Maisie's my daughter, and you don't get to show up here claiming rights you never wanted. Wade's smile didn't reach his eyes. That's not what I heard. Heard you're trying to steal land that doesn't belong to you. I'm not stealing anything. County says different. Says this place belongs to the Mercer estate. Wade finally looked at Elias. You Mercer? Elias walked over slowly, deliberately. I am. Wade sized him up. Funny, you don't look like a man who owns much. Looks can be deceiving. That right? Wade turned back to Ruth. So you've been squatting on his land for 3 years, and now you filed a claim to take it. That about cover it? That's none of your business, Wade. It is if it affects Maisie. Girl needs stability, a proper home, not some... He waved a hand at the ranch. Broken down shack with a woman who can't keep a man around. Ruth's face went white. Get out. I'm just saying, if you can't provide for her, maybe it's time someone else did. Elias stepped forward. She asked you to leave. Wade's eyes narrowed. And who the hell are you to tell me anything? The man who owns this land, which means you're trespassing. For a moment, Wade looked like he might swing. His fists clenched, his shoulders squared. Then he smiled. Interesting. So you are claiming it. Good to know. He climbed back on his horse. Before riding off, he looked down at Ruth. This isn't over. You can't hide out here forever, Ruth, and when reality comes knocking, I'll be waiting. He rode away. Ruth stood frozen on the porch, hands shaking. Elias walked over. Who was that? My brother-in-law, Maisie's uncle. She sat down hard on the steps. He's been trying to take her since she was born, says I'm unfit, that she'd be better off with him and his wife. Is he right? Ruth's head snapped up. No. Then why does he keep coming around? Because he knows I'm vulnerable. No husband, no money, living on borrowed land. Her voice cracked. And now with the claim contest, he thinks he's got leverage. If I lose the ranch, he'll argue I can't provide a stable home, and the court might agree. Elias sat down beside her. He can't take her. He can try. And if I don't have this place... She stopped, wiped her eyes roughly. This ranch is all I have, Elias. It's the only thing keeping us safe. And there it was. The full weight of what was at stake. Not just land, not just a house. A little girl's future, a mother's ability to protect her. Elias looked out at the valley, at the fences Ruth had mended, the garden she'd planted, the life she'd built from ruins, and he made a decision. He's not taking anything, Elias said quietly. Ruth looked at him. What? Wade. The county. None of them. He turned to face her. I'm going to town tomorrow. I'm paying the taxes in full. And then I'm going to make sure the deed is in both our names. Ruth blinked. Both our names? You rebuilt this place. You made it live again. That counts for something, and I'm not going to let anyone, including me, take it from you. Elias, you don't have to. I do. Because Maisie was right. You need help. And I'm here, so let me help. Ruth stared at him, eyes searching his face for the lie. The catch. The moment where he'd pull the rug out. But Elias didn't look away. Finally, Ruth said, Why? Because I spent 6 years running from a graveyard, and you turned it into a home. That's worth fighting for. Tears spilled down Ruth's cheeks. She wiped them away, frustrated, but they kept coming. Elias reached out, hesitated, then gently took her hand. She didn't pull away. They sat there on the porch, hands clasped, watching the sun move across the valley, while inside the house, Maisie sang to herself and Jericho bleated his eternal suspicion of the world. For the first time in 6 years, Elias felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He lay in the barn staring at the darkness, his mind running through numbers he didn't have and promises he wasn't sure he could keep. $160. He had maybe 40 in his pocket and another 70 in the bank 2 towns over. That left him 50 short, and the auction was in 3 weeks. He could wire for the money from his last job, but that would take time he didn't have. Could try to borrow it, but from who? He'd burned every bridge he had when he left 6 years ago, and the people in town didn't know him from a hole in the ground. The barn door creaked open. Ruth stood silhouetted in the moonlight, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. You awake? She said. Yeah. She came in, sat down on a hay bale across from his bedroll. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. I've been thinking about what you said, Ruth finally said, about putting both our names on the deed. And I don't know if that's smart, for either of us. Elias sat up, the hay crunching beneath him. Why not? Because what happens when you want to leave again? You think you won't, but people always do. And then I'm stuck in a partnership with a ghost, and Maisie's the one who suffers. I'm not leaving. You don't know that. I do. Ruth shook her head, and in the dim light filtering through the barn slats, Elias could see the weariness etched into her face. You can't promise that, Elias. Nobody can. My husband promised me forever, and he was gone before Maisie even took her first breath. Claire's husband promised to take care of her, and he drank himself to death 3 years into their marriage. Promises are just words people say when they want to believe their own lies. The bitterness in her voice cut deeper than any accusation could have. What if we made it legal? Elias said. A contract, something that protects both of us. What kind of contract? I don't know. Something that says if I leave, the land goes to you, and if you leave, it stays with whoever's still here. Something in writing that can't be broken by, he searched for the right word, by weakness. Ruth considered this, picking at a loose thread on her shawl. You'd really do that? If it means keeping weight away from Maisie? Yeah. She studied him in the dim light, and Elias could see her weighing the risk. Trusting him meant gambling everything she'd built, but not trusting him meant losing it for sure. All right, she said quietly. We'll try it your way. But if you screw me over, Elias Mercer, I swear I'll make you regret it. I'll tell everyone in 3 counties what kind of man you really are. I'll make sure you can't get work anywhere. I get it, Elias said. And I won't. Screw you over, I mean. Ruth stood to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I don't think you're a bad man. I just think you're a broken one. And broken things don't always hold together when you need them most. She left before he could respond. Elias lay back down, her words echoing in his head. Broken. Yeah, he was that. The question was whether he was broken beyond fixing, or just broken enough to understand what Ruth had been through. To understand what it meant to survive when everything told you to quit. He thought about Caroline again. About the last conversation they'd had before the fire, when she'd found him sitting outside at midnight, staring at nothing. What's wrong? She'd asked. Just thinking. About what? About whether I'm doing enough. For you, for Samuel, for this place. Caroline had sat beside him, taken his hand. You're doing more than enough, Elias, But you need to stop measuring yourself against some impossible standard. Life isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up every day, even when it's hard. He'd kissed her then, told her he loved her. And 2 days later, she was gone. Elias closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but all he could see was Caroline's face, Ruth's face, the way they blurred together in his mind. 2 women who'd asked him to show up. One he'd failed. One he was trying desperately not to fail again. Morning came too fast. Elias woke to Maisie banging on the barn door with what sounded like a stick. "Elias, Mama says you're going to town." He stumbled out, still half asleep, eyes gritty. "That's right. Can I come?" "Not this time, kiddo." Maisie's face fell dramatically. "Why not?" "Because I've got boring business to handle. You'd hate it." "I like boring things." "No, you don't. You talk to a ram for fun." "Jericho's not boring. He's fascinating. Yesterday he told me about—" Ruth appeared, drying her hands on her apron. "Maisie, leave him alone. Go feed the chickens." Maisie trudged off, muttering complaints to Jericho, who bleated what sounded like agreement from across the yard. Ruth handed Elias a cloth bundle. "Food for the ride. And coffee. It's cold, but it's better than nothing." "Thanks." "You sure about this?" she asked, voice low. "The money, the taxes, all of it?" "I'm sure." "What if you can't get enough?" "Then I'll figure something out." Ruth didn't look convinced, but she nodded. "Be careful in town. People talk. And if Wade hears you're trying to save this place, he'll make trouble." "Let him try." Elias saddled his horse and rode out as the sun broke over the ridge. The valley looked different now, less like a graveyard and more like something worth saving. He wondered if that was because of Ruth, or because he'd finally stopped seeing ghosts everywhere he looked. Probably both. Town was busier than last time. Market day, from the looks of it. Wagons lined the street, farmers selling produce, women haggling over fabric and flour. Elias tied his horse at the livery and headed straight for the bank. The banker was a thin man with spectacles and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He looked up when Elias walked in, recognition flickering across his face. "Mr. Mercer, back again. I need a wire for funds from the First Bank of Silver Hill." The banker's smile tightened. "That'll take 3 to 5 days. I need it in 2. "Can't guarantee that." "Then I'll pay extra." The banker considered this, tapping his pen against the ledger. "How much are we talking?" $70. "And how much extra are you willing to pay for the rush?" Elias gritted his teeth, doing the math in his head. Every dollar mattered. "5. Make it 10 and I'll see what I can do." It was robbery, pure and simple. But Elias didn't have a choice. "Fine. 10. The banker pulled out paperwork, sliding it across the counter with practiced efficiency. "Name?" "Elias Mercer." The man's hand paused. He looked up, eyes narrowing behind his spectacles. "Mercer. You related to the ranch property going up for auction?" "I own it." "Thought you were dead." "Clearly not." The banker set down his pen, leaning back in his chair. "Well, Mr. Mercer, you've caused quite a stir. Woman out there filed an adverse possession claim. Says she's been maintaining the property for years." "I know." "You contesting it?" "No, I'm paying the taxes and settling it." The banker's eyebrows rose. "Settling it how?" "That's between me and her." The man studied Elias for a long moment, clearly trying to piece together the story. "You should know. People in town are watching. That woman's got a reputation." "For what?" "For being stubborn, difficult, the kind that doesn't know when to quit." He said it like it was a flaw, something shameful. Elias felt his jaw tighten. "Sounds like a strength to me." The banker shrugged. "Suit yourself. Sign here." Elias signed, paid the fee, watching 10 precious dollars disappear, and left before he said something he'd regret. Next stop was the land office. The same bored clerk from before looked up from his ledger, recognition dawning slowly. "Back again?" "I want to make a partial payment, $30 toward the tax debt." The clerk took the money, counted it twice with maddening slowness, and made a note in the ledger. "Still leaves you $130 short, and that doesn't stop the auction." "I know. I'll have the rest in a week." "You sure about that?" I'm sure. The clerk handed him a receipt, studying him with mild curiosity. You know, most people who let property go this long don't come back. What made you change your mind? Elias folded the receipt carefully. Found a reason to. He left the land office and walked the main street trying to figure out where to get the remaining $50. He could sell his horse, but then he'd have no way to work. Could try to pick up a job, but there was no time. Everything he thought of led to dead ends. He was so focused on the problem that he almost walked past Clara without seeing her. "Elias Mercer," she called from the general store porch. "Thought that was you." He stopped. Clara was standing there in her usual stance, arms crossed, sharp gaze fixed on him like a hawk spotting a mouse. "Clara, Ruth know you're in town?" "She does." "Good, because if you're here causing trouble, I'll hear about it." She paused. "And then you'll hear from me." "I'm not causing trouble, just handling business." Clara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You paying those taxes?" "Trying to." "How much you got?" "Not enough." She studied him with those sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through every lie he'd ever told. "Ruth told me what you're planning, putting both names on the deed." "That a problem?" "Depends. You planning to stick around, or is this just guilt talking?" Elias met her eyes. "I'm staying." "Uh-huh. And when things get hard, when the work's brutal and the money's tight and you remember why you left in the first place?" "I'll still be there." Clara didn't look convinced, but after a long moment she nodded slowly. "All right. I'll believe it when I see it." She reached into her apron and pulled out a folded envelope. "This is from the church collection. $50. Ruth doesn't know I've got it, and she wouldn't take it if she did. Too proud for her own good." Elias stared at the envelope like it might bite him. "I can't." "You can and you will, because that little girl needs a home and Ruth needs help whether she admits it or not." Clara pressed the envelope into his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "You pay those taxes, you make this right, and if you ever hurt that woman or her daughter, I'll hunt you down myself. Understand?" Elias nodded, throat tight. "Understood." Clara patted his arm. "Good man. Now get out of here before someone sees us talking and starts gossiping." Elias left town with the money in his saddlebag and a weight lifting from his chest. He had enough now. Barely, but enough. The taxes would be paid. The auction would be stopped. And then the real work would begin. He was halfway back to the ranch when he heard the horse behind him. Fast. Gaining. Elias turned in the saddle and saw Wade Bennett riding hard, closing the distance. There was something about the way he rode, aggressive, purposeful, that set Elias's nerves on edge. "Mercer!" Wade shouted. "Hold up!" Elias pulled his horse to a stop and waited. Wade rode up alongside him, his horse dancing sideways, foam at its mouth. Wade's face was flushed, eyes hard. "We need to talk," Wade said. "About what?" "About you making deals with Ruth." "That's between me and her." "Like hell it is." Wade's horse danced again, and he jerked the reins roughly. "That woman's got no business trying to claim land that doesn't belong to her, and you've got no business helping her. She's been living there for 3 years. She's earned it. She's squatting. There's a difference." Elias's patience, already worn thin, started to fray. "What do you want, Wade?" "I want you to stop. Let the auction happen. Let someone responsible buy that land." "Someone like you?" Wade smiled, cold and sharp. "I'd take care of it. And I'd take care of Maisie, too. Give her a proper home with a proper family." "Ruth's her family. Ruth's a broke woman living on borrowed time. That girl deserves better." Elias's hand tightened on the reins until his knuckles went white. "You don't care about Maisie. You just want to punish Ruth." "I care about what's right." "Then leave them alone." Wade's smile vanished. "I can't do that. See, I've got a responsibility to my niece, and if you keep interfering, I'll make sure the county knows exactly who you are. A man who abandoned his property for 6 years. A man who let it rot while good people suffered. You think a judge is going to side with you over Ruth's claim? Think again." "I'm not fighting Ruth's claim. I'm helping her." "Then you're a fool." Wade yanked his horse around violently. "You've got until the auction, Mercer. After that, I'll do whatever it takes to get that girl away from a woman who can't even keep a roof over her head without stealing someone else's land." He rode off, leaving Elias alone on the trail, anger simmering in his chest like a banked fire. Elias sat there for a long moment, breathing hard, fists clenched. Wade wasn't going to stop. He'd keep pushing, keep threatening, keep trying to tear Ruth down until he got what he wanted, unless someone stopped him. Elias rode the rest of the way home in silence, mind working through possibilities. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun was setting and Ruth was on the porch watching for him. "You get it done?" she called. Elias dismounted. "Partial payment made, the rest will be ready in a few days." Relief washed over Ruth's face like sunrise. "Really? Really?" She came down the steps, and for a moment Elias thought she might hug him, but she stopped short, just stood there looking at him like she couldn't quite believe it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet. We've still got Wade to deal with." Ruth's expression darkened. "He came to town?" "Stopped me on the trail, made threats." "What kind of threats?" "The kind that says he's not backing down." Ruth's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I'm not afraid of him." "You should be. He's got connections, money, and he knows how to work the system." "Then what do we do?" Elias looked at her. This woman who'd rebuilt a ranch with her bare hands, who'd survived winters and hardship, and men like Wade who thought they could break her just by wanting to. "We fight," he said. "Together." Ruth nodded slowly. "Together." That night, after Maisie went to bed, Ruth and Elias sat at the kitchen table and made a plan. Ruth would continue with her adverse possession claim, arguing that 3 years of continuous occupation gave her rights to the land. Elias would pay the taxes and file paperwork establishing joint ownership, contingent on the claim being resolved. It wasn't perfect. There were gaps, legal gray areas that could go either way depending on which judge heard the case and what kind of mood he was in, but it was something. "What about Wade?" Ruth asked, wrapping her hands around a cup of cold coffee. "What about him?" "He's not going to just let this go. He'll find some other way to come after us. He always does." "Probably." Ruth pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You ready for that?" Elias thought about it. About Wade's threats, the legal battles that might be coming, the ways a man with money and connections could make life difficult for people trying to build something from nothing. "Yeah," he said. "I'm ready." Ruth glanced at him, something shifting in her expression. "You've changed." "How?" "When you first got here, you looked like a man who wanted to disappear, like you were just waiting for permission to fade away completely. Now you look like someone who's planning to stay." "Maybe I am." "What changed?" Elias didn't answer right away. He watched the lamp flame flicker, casting shadows on the walls Caroline had once painted, the walls Ruth had scrubbed and repaired. "I stopped running," he said finally, "or maybe I just found something worth standing still for." Ruth didn't say anything, just nodded, like she understood, like maybe she'd been looking for the same thing. They sat there until the cold drove them inside their separate spaces, Ruth to her room, Elias to the barn. But something had changed. Some invisible line had been crossed. They weren't just two people sharing space anymore. They were a team. Wade came back 3 days later. Elias was repairing the barn roof when he heard the horses. Plural. He looked down to see Wade riding into the yard, flanked by 2 other men Elias didn't recognize. One carried a rifle across his saddle, not pointed at anyone, but visible, deliberate. The other had the look of someone who got paid to intimidate people and was good at his job. Elias climbed down slowly, deliberately, taking his time, making Wade wait. Ruth came out of the house, wiping flour from her hands. Maisie appeared behind her, eyes wide. "Stay inside," Ruth said to Maisie, voice firm. "But, Mama!" "Inside, now!" Maisie obeyed, but Elias could see her watching through the window, small face pressed against the glass. Wade dismounted with theatrical slowness, smiling that cold smile. "Heard you paid the taxes. Congratulations." "What do you want, Wade?" Ruth said. "Just came to see if the rumors were true, that you and Mr. Mercer here got married." He said the word like it was something dirty. "We did." "How convenient, right before the claim hearing." "It's legal, filed with the county." Wade's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "I'm sure it is. Doesn't change the fact that this whole thing smells like fraud." Elias stepped forward. "It's not fraud. It's a marriage." A marriage of convenience. Judge is going to see right through it. Then let him. We've got nothing to hide. Wade looked between them, eyes calculating, adding up details. You know what I think? I think you're two desperate people trying to game the system. And when the county realizes that, they're going to give me exactly what I came for. You're not getting Maisie, Ruth said, voice hard as iron. We'll see about that. Wade turned to his men, nodding. Let's go. They rode off, leaving dust and tension hanging in the air like smoke. Ruth's hands were shaking. Elias reached out and took one. He's bluffing, Elias said. What if he's not? Then we fight, like we said we would. Ruth pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself. You don't understand. Wade has money, influence, friends in the county office. If he convinces the judge that our marriage is fake, it's not fake. We're legally married. We're raising Maisie together. We're running this ranch together. That's real. But we don't... Ruth stopped, looked away. Don't what? We don't love each other, she said quietly, and the words hit like stones. And Wade knows it. Everyone knows it. It's a transaction, a business arrangement, and that's not what marriage is supposed to be. Elias felt something twist in his chest. Is that what you think this is? Isn't it? He wanted to argue, to tell her that maybe it started as a transaction, but somewhere along the way, between fixing fences and planting gardens and sitting on the porch watching Maisie chase chickens, it had become something else. But he didn't know how to say that without sounding like a fool or a liar. So instead he said, Does it matter? We're here. We're committed. And we're not letting Wade take anything from us. Ruth studied him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Truth, maybe. Or just certainty. All right, she said finally. We fight. The claim hearing was scheduled for the following week. Ruth and Elias spent the days preparing, gathering proof of Ruth's work on the ranch, documenting the repairs, the improvements, the 3 years she'd spent making the land productive again. Clara came out to help. She brought letters from neighbors who'd seen Ruth working the property, who could testify to her presence and effort. It wasn't much, but it was something, a foundation to build on. You nervous? Clara asked Ruth while Elias was outside chopping wood. Terrified, Ruth admitted. Wade's a bully, but bullies don't do well in front of judges who actually care about the law. And if the judge doesn't care? Clara squeezed her hand. Then you've got me, and you've got Elias, and we don't quit, any of us. The night before the hearing, Elias found Ruth in the garden. She was just standing there, staring at the rows of plants she'd nurtured from seeds, hands hanging limp at her sides. You okay? He asked. I keep thinking about what happens if we lose. We're not going to lose, but if we do, if Wade gets his way, her voice cracked. I can't let him take her, Elias. I can't. She's everything. She's the only good thing I've ever made. Elias stepped closer, close enough to see the tears gathering in her eyes. He won't. I promise you, Ruth. Whatever it takes, he's not getting Maisie. Ruth turned to face him, and in the fading light, Elias saw the fear she'd been hiding, the terror of a mother who'd fought too hard and too long to lose everything now. How can you be so sure? She whispered. Because I know what it's like to lose family, and I'm not letting it happen again. Not to you, not to her. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. I'm scared. I know, me too. She surprised him by stepping forward and leaning against his chest. Elias froze for a second, unsure, then wrapped his arms around her. They stood there in the garden while the sun set and the world kept turning, holding each other like two people drowning. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something. Something real and solid and worth fighting for. The courthouse was packed. Apparently word had spread that this was going to be a good show. A woman fighting for land she didn't own, a man who'd disappeared for 6 years, and Wade Bennett with his money and his lawyers trying to prove they were all liars and thieves. The judge was an older man with gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too much nonsense to be impressed by anything. He banged his gavel and called the room to order. Ruth's lawyer, a young man Clara had found who worked for cheap and coffee, stood and presented their case. 3 years of continuous occupation, documented improvements, letters from neighbors, proof that Ruth had maintained the property when the legal owner had abandoned it. Wade's lawyer countered with arguments about legal ownership, property rights, and the fact that Ruth had never paid taxes or obtained permission to live there. He was smooth, polished, the kind of lawyer who knew exactly how to make an honest woman sound like a criminal. It went back and forth for over an hour. Technical arguments, legal precedents, words that meant everything and nothing. Elias sat next to Ruth, watching her grip the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. Finally, the judge held up a hand. Enough. I've heard what I need to hear. The room went silent. Even the people in the back stopped whispering. The judge looked at Ruth. Mrs. Mercer, you've presented compelling evidence that you maintained this property for 3 years. However, the law is clear. Adverse possession requires continuous occupation without permission from the owner, and Mr. Mercer here is the owner. Ruth's face went pale. That said, the judge continued, I'm not in the business of punishing people for hard work, and from what I can see, you did more than just occupy this land. You saved it. He turned to Elias. Mr. Mercer, you abandoned your property for 6 years. Legally, that's your right. But morally? He shook his head. You left this woman to do the work you should have been doing, so here's my ruling. The room held its breath. The adverse possession claim is denied. The land remains in Mr. Mercer's name. Wade started to smile. And Mrs. Mercer's name as joint owners per the deed filed last week, which means this whole hearing was pointless because you two already settled it yourselves. Ruth exhaled, shaky and relieved. Wade stood, face red. Your Honor, this is clearly a fraudulent marriage designed to circumvent— Sit down, Mr. Bennett. The judge's voice was sharp as a whip crack. But, I said sit down. Wade sat, fists clenched on the table. The judge looked at Ruth and Elias. You two want my advice? Stop worrying about what this marriage is or isn't and start worrying about making it work. You've got a kid depending on you, a ranch that needs running, and from what I can see, you're both too stubborn to quit, so don't. He banged his gavel. Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted. Clara cheered. Wade stormed out. Elias turned to Ruth, and she was crying, big, messy, relieved tears streaming down her face. We won, she said. We won. She hugged him right there in front of everyone, and Elias didn't care who saw, didn't care what they thought. For the first time in 6 years, he felt like he'd won something that mattered. Wade tried one last play. He showed up at the ranch 2 days later, but this time he was alone. No hired muscle, no lawyers, just Wade, looking older and meaner and desperate. Elias met him at the fence line. You're not welcome here. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to make you an offer. I'm not interested. Wade pulled out a folded paper from his coat. $10,000 for the ranch. Cash. You and Ruth can take it, start over somewhere else, and everyone's happy. Elias stared at him. You really think we'd sell? I think you're smart enough to know when you're beat. That ranch is more work than it's worth. Ruth's going to burn herself out trying to keep it running. And you? Wade smiled, ugly and knowing. You're going to leave again. It's what you do. It's who you are. Elias felt anger flare hot in his chest. I'm not leaving. Sure you are. Men like you always do. You'll get tired of playing farmer, tired of playing husband, tired of pretending you're someone you're not. And you'll ride off just like before, leaving Ruth and that little girl to pick up the pieces. Wade tucked the paper back in his pocket. When you do, that offer stands, and Maisie comes with me. Get off my land, Elias said, voice low and dangerous. Wade studied him, searching for weakness. You know what your problem is, Mercer? You think you can fix what's broken by pretending it never broke? But it did. You broke. Your family broke. This whole place broke. And one day Ruth's going to see you for what you really are, a coward who ran when things got hard. Elias's fist connected with Wade's jaw before he realized he'd swung. Wade stumbled back, hit the ground hard, dust rising around him. You're done here, Elias said, standing over him. Done threatening Ruth. Done threatening Maisie. You come back and I'll make sure the sheriff knows you've been harassing my family. Understand? Wade spat blood into the dirt. This isn't over. Yeah, it is. Wade climbed to his feet slowly, gave Elias one last hateful look, and rode off. Ruth came running from the house. What happened? Wade made an offer. I declined. Did you have to hit him? Yeah, I did. Ruth looked like she wanted to be mad, but instead she just sighed. Well, at least now he knows we're serious. He's not coming back. How do you know? Because I told him the truth, that this is our home, and we're not giving it up for anything. Ruth searched his face, looking for cracks. Did you mean that? Every word. She nodded slowly. Good, because I'm not going anywhere either. And standing there in the yard with dust settling and the sun warm on their faces, Elias realized something had fundamentally changed. This wasn't just about saving the ranch anymore. It was about building something that lasted. The wire transfer came through on a Tuesday. Elias rode into town before dawn, the air still cold enough to see his breath, collected the $70 from the bank, added Clara's $50 and his remaining cash, and walked into the land office with $162 in his pocket, just enough to clear the debt with $2 to spare. The clerk counted it twice, made the entry in his ledger with deliberate slowness, and stamped the receipt with more force than necessary. Debt satisfied, he said flatly. Auctions canceled. Elias took the receipt, folded it carefully, and put it in his shirt pocket next to his heart. 6 years of back taxes, gone. 6 years of running, over. The land was his again, legally, officially. Except it wasn't just his anymore. He stopped at the county courthouse on the way out of town and filed the joint ownership papers. Ruth's name next to his on the deed. Equal partners, 50-50. The clerk raised an eyebrow but didn't comment, just processed the paperwork with the bored efficiency of someone who'd seen stranger things. You know this is unusual, the clerk said, sliding the completed documents across the counter. So I've heard. Most men don't share ownership with their wives, especially not equal shares. Elias met his eyes. Most men didn't abandon their land for 6 years while a woman rebuilt it from ashes with her bare hands and sheer stubbornness. The clerk had nothing to say to that. He just handed Elias the deed and turned back to his filing. When Elias got back to the ranch, Ruth was in the garden with Maisie. They were planting something. He couldn't tell what from a distance. But they were laughing. Real laughing. The kind that came from deep in the belly. Maisie had dirt smeared across her face like war paint, and Ruth's braid had come completely undone, hair falling around her shoulders in a way Elias had never seen before. He stood at the fence for a long moment, just watching, memorizing. This was what he'd paid for. Not the land, not the house, not even his own redemption. This exact moment, a woman and a little girl laughing in a garden, building something that would feed them through winter. Ruth looked up and saw him. The laughter faded into something more cautious, but not fearful. Well? Elias pulled the papers from his saddlebag and held them up. It's done. Taxes paid. Deed filed. The ranch is ours. Ruth stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. Dirt streaked across the fabric like proof of work. Ours? 50-50, like we agreed. She walked over, leaving Maisie to continue planting, and took the papers. Her hands were shaking as she read them. Once. Twice. Like she couldn't quite believe the words would stay on the page. You really did it, she whispered. I said I would. Ruth looked up at him, and for the first time since they'd met, there was no suspicion in her eyes. No guardedness, no wall between them, just something raw and grateful and maybe a little terrified. Thank you, she said. You don't have to. Thank you, Elias. Her voice cracked on his name. Maisie ran over and grabbed his hand, leaving muddy fingerprints on his sleeve. Does this mean we get to stay forever? Yeah, kiddo, forever. She whooped and dragged him toward the garden to show him what they were planting. Tomatoes, apparently. Ruth had saved seeds from last year's crop, carefully dried and stored through winter. Mama says these are special, Maisie explained with the seriousness of someone entrusted with important knowledge. She says they're from her grandmother's garden and her grandmother's grandmother before that. They've been growing for 100 years. Elias knelt in the dirt beside them, and Ruth handed him a trowel without asking. They worked in silence, the three of them, planting things that wouldn't bear fruit for months, planning for a future that, a month ago, none of them thought they'd have. That night, after Maisie went to bed, Ruth and Elias sat on the porch. The stars were out, thick and bright enough to read by. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Jericho answered with his usual indignation, followed by a softer bleat that might have been satisfaction. Wade's not going to let this go, Ruth said quietly. I know. He'll find some other way to come after us, some angle we haven't thought of. Probably. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the night wasn't particularly cold. You ready for that? Elias thought about it. About Wade's threats, the legal battles that might still be coming, the ways a man with money and connections and a deep well of bitterness could make life difficult for people just trying to build something decent. Yeah, he said. I'm ready. Ruth glanced at him, studying his profile in the starlight. You've changed. How? When you first got here, you looked like a man who wanted to disappear, like you were just a ghost waiting for permission to fade away completely. Now you look like someone who's planning to stay, who's choosing to stay. Maybe I am. What changed? Elias didn't answer right away. He watched the valley, the land he'd abandoned and then reclaimed, the land Ruth had saved. I stopped running, he said finally. Or maybe I just found something worth standing still for, worth fighting for. Ruth didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, so quietly, he almost missed it. I'm glad you stayed. Me too. They sat there until the cold drove them inside, and even then, Elias lingered on the porch, listening to Ruth move around the kitchen, getting ready for bed, listening to the sounds of a house that was lived in, loved in, fought for. He thought about Caroline, about how she would have liked Ruth, how Samuel would have followed Maisie around like a puppy, fascinated by her fearlessness. And for the first time, thinking about them didn't feel like drowning. It just felt like remembering. Winter came hard that year. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you wonder if spring was just a lie people told themselves to get through the dark months. Snow fell early and stayed late, piling up against the fences, turning the valley into something from a dream. But the ranch held. The repairs Elias and Ruth had made kept the wind out and the heat in. The garden, dormant now, waited patiently beneath its blanket of snow. The animals stayed warm in the barn. And every morning, smoke rose from the chimney like a promise that they were still there, still fighting, still alive. Elias and Ruth fell into a rhythm. Morning started with coffee and planning the day's work. They'd bundle up and head outside, splitting tasks, Elias handling the heavier repairs and animal care, Ruth managing the household and food stores. Maisie helped where she could, though mostly she just talked to Jericho and invented elaborate games involving sticks and snow. At night, they'd gather around the fire. Ruth would mend clothes or plan next season's garden, while Elias carved small wooden animals for Maisie. She'd collect them like treasures, lining them up on her windowsill and giving each one a name and personality. They didn't talk much during these evenings, didn't need to. The silence was comfortable, full of the small sounds of people sharing space who'd learned to trust each other. One particularly brutal night, when the wind howled like something alive and angry, Elias woke to find the barn door rattling violently. He got up to secure it and found Ruth already outside in her nightgown and boots, fighting with the latch. "What are you doing?" he shouted over the wind. "What does it look like? The door's going to tear off." Together they wrestled it closed and secured it with rope. By the time they finished, both were shivering violently, covered in snow. They ran back to the house, and Ruth immediately went to stoke the fire while Elias changed into dry clothes. When he came back, she'd made coffee, strong enough to strip paint, and was wrapped in a blanket by the hearth. "You should have woken me," Elias said, accepting the cup she offered. "I did try. You sleep like the dead. Still, you shouldn't be out there alone." Ruth smiled slightly. "I've been doing things alone for 3 years, Elias. I'm not helpless." "I know you're not, but you don't have to be alone anymore." Something shifted in Ruth's expression. She looked at him for a long moment, firelight dancing across her face, making her eyes look almost gold. "No," she said quietly. "I don't." They sat there drinking coffee until dawn, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment. Maisie turned 8 in February. Ruth baked a cake, lopsided and slightly burnt on one side, but made with care. Clara came out with a present, a hand-carved wooden horse that made Maisie shriek with delight and immediately claim it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Elias gave her new boots, sturdy leather ones he'd traded for in town, sized to fit her growing feet with room to spare. "They're perfect," Maisie declared, hugging him with the full-body enthusiasm only children could muster. That night, after Maisie went to bed clutching her wooden horse, Ruth and Elias sat by the fire. Clara had left hours ago, but the warmth of the celebration still lingered. "I was thinking," Ruth said, staring into the flames, "about spring." "What about it?" "We should expand the garden, plant more corn, maybe some wheat if we can get seeds, trade the surplus in town for things we need." "Sounds good," Ruth hesitated. "I was also thinking we could fix up the barn properly, turn part of it into a workshop. You're good with your hands, could make furniture, sell it." Elias looked at her. "You planning for the future?" "Aren't you?" He realized he was. For the first time in 6 years, he was thinking beyond tomorrow, beyond next week. He was thinking about seasons, about years, about a life built slow and steady on land that had almost destroyed him, but was now giving him a reason to stay whole. "Yeah," he said, "I guess I am." Ruth smiled, and it transformed her face, made her look younger, lighter, like she'd set down a burden she'd been carrying too long. "Good, because I need you to stick around. I can't run this place alone forever." "You did for 3 years, and it almost killed me." She turned to face him fully. "I'm glad you're here, Elias. Even if it started weird. Even if we're still figuring out what this is, I'm glad." Elias felt something crack open in his chest. Not breaking, just opening, making room for something new. "Me too," he said. They sat there, the fire crackling between them, and Elias thought about how strange life was, how you could lose everything and still find something worth keeping, how the worst day of your life didn't have to be the end of your story. It could just be the middle. February bled into March. The snow began to melt, revealing the dead grass and mud beneath. The creek swelled with runoff, rushing loud and wild. Jericho's winter coat started to shed in clumps, making him look even more disreputable than usual. And Wade came back. Elias was in town getting supplies when he heard. The sheriff pulled him aside outside the general store, looking uncomfortable. "Thought you should know," the sheriff said. "Wade Bennett filed a formal complaint. Says you assaulted him." Elias's stomach dropped. "When?" "Last month, when he came to your property." The sheriff shifted his weight. "Look, I know Wade, know what kind of man he is, but he's got witnesses saying you hit him unprovoked." "He threatened my family." "That's what you say, but unless you've got proof..." "I've got Ruth. She saw everything." The sheriff looked even more uncomfortable. "Wade's lawyer is arguing that Ruth's testimony doesn't count, says she's biased because she's your wife. That's ridiculous. Maybe, but the judge might see it different." The sheriff sighed. "You need to get yourself a lawyer, Elias. This could get ugly." Elias rode back to the ranch with his mind racing. They didn't have money for a lawyer, barely had enough to get through to harvest. And Wade knew it. This was his play, tie them up in legal battles they couldn't afford to fight. When he told Ruth, she went very still. "How much would a lawyer cost?" she asked. "More than we have." "Then we represent ourselves." "Ruth, we represent ourselves," she said firmly. "I'm not letting Wade win because we're poor. We tell the truth. We show the judge what kind of man Wade really is. And we fight." Elias looked at this woman, this stubborn, fierce, impossible woman, and felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. "All right," he said. "We fight." The hearing was set for 2 weeks later. In the meantime, they prepared. Ruth documented every time Wade had come to the property, every threat he'd made. Clara provided letters from neighbors who'd witnessed Wade's intimidation tactics. They built their case piece by piece with determination and hope, and not much else. The night before the hearing, Elias found Ruth in the garden again. It was becoming her thinking place, the spot where she went when the world felt too heavy. "You scared?" he asked. "Terrified." "Me too." Ruth turned to face him, and in the fading light, she looked vulnerable in a way he'd never seen. "What if we lose? What if Wade finds a way to make this stick?" "Then we appeal. We keep fighting." "With what money?" "We'll figure it out." "You keep saying that, but what if we can't figure it out? What if trying isn't enough? Isn't..." Elias stepped closer, close enough to take her hands in his. They were rough from work, calloused and strong, and he'd never held anything that felt more right. "Then we fail," he said. "But we fail together, and we get back up together, And we keep going until there's nothing left to fight with. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. I'm so tired of fighting. I know. I just want to live, to raise my daughter, to work this land and not have to look over my shoulder waiting for the next blow. You will. We will. She searched his face, looking for certainty he wasn't sure he had, but he met her gaze and didn't look away. I love you, Ruth said suddenly, and the world stopped. Elias's heart stopped. His breath stopped. Everything stopped. What? I love you. Her voice was stronger now, more sure. I don't know when it happened. Maybe when you fixed the roof in the rain and came down soaking wet and covered in mud, but smiling like you'd won something. Maybe when you hit Wade for threatening Maisie. Maybe when you sat with her for 3 hours teaching her how to mend fence wire even though she kept getting it wrong. Ruth took a shaky breath. But I do. I love you. And I needed you to know, before tomorrow, before whatever happens next. Elias couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he could do was pull her close and hold her like she might disappear if he let go. I love you too, he said into her hair, and realized it was true. Somewhere between the lies and the arguments and the slow, steady work of building a life together, he'd fallen in love with this stubborn, fierce, impossible woman who'd saved his land and maybe saved him too. Ruth pulled back just enough to look at him. Really? Really? She kissed him then, and it was nothing like his first kiss with Caroline, young and sweet and full of promises about forever. This was different, harder, real, a kiss that tasted like coffee and determination and survival. When they pulled apart, both were crying. Whatever happens tomorrow, Ruth said, I want you to know this was real, all of it, not a transaction, not a convenience, real. I know. They stood there in the garden, holding each other while the sun set and the stars came out, two broken people who'd somehow managed to piece themselves back together. The courtroom was packed again. Apparently nothing entertained a small town like watching the same people fight the same battles over and over. Elias recognized faces from the last hearing, farmers who had nothing better to do, women who lived for gossip, the banker who'd charged him extra for the wire transfer. Wade sat at the plaintiff's table with his expensive lawyer, looking smug and confident. Elias and Ruth sat at the defense table with their handwritten notes and their truth. The judge, a different one this time, younger and harder to read, called the court to order. Wade's lawyer presented their case. Assault. Unprovoked violence, a dangerous man with a history of abandonment and instability. They painted Elias as someone barely holding himself together, prone to outbursts, a threat. Then it was Ruth's turn to speak. She stood, walked to the front, and looked at the judge. Your Honor, she said, voice steady despite the trembling hands. My husband didn't attack Wade Bennett. He defended our family. Wade came to our property, our home, and threatened to take my daughter from me. He's been threatening that for years. And when Elias told him to leave, Wade kept pushing, kept saying Elias would abandon us, kept trying to make him feel like he was nothing. She pulled out the letters from Clara and the neighbors. These document Wade's pattern of harassment, of intimidation, of showing up at our home with armed men to threaten us. The judge took the letters, read them slowly. Ruth continued, Wade doesn't care about right and wrong. He cares about control, about punishing me for being a woman who won't bow down to him, and he's using this court to do it. Mrs. Mercer, the judge said, do you have any actual witnesses to the alleged assault? Just me. And your testimony is that your husband acted in defense of your family? Yes, Your Honor. The judge looked at Wade. Mr. Bennett, why did you go to the Mercer property that day? Wade's lawyer started to speak, but the judge held up a hand. I asked Mr. Bennett. Wade stood. I was checking on my niece, making sure she was being properly cared for. By bringing armed men? For my protection. Protection from what? Wade hesitated. From Mr. Mercer. I'd heard he had a violent temper. Heard from who? From people in town. Names? Wade's face reddened. I don't recall exactly. The judge sat back. Mr. Bennett, I've reviewed your history with Mrs. Mercer. This is the 4th time you've tried to use this court to gain custody of her daughter. Each time, your claims have been found without merit. Why should this time be different? Because this time she's married to a violent man, a man who defended his home from an uninvited visitor, That's not violence, that's protection. The judge looked at his notes. Case dismissed. And Mr. Bennett, if you continue this pattern of harassment, I'll issue a restraining order. Do I make myself clear? Wade's face went purple. This is clear, Mr. Bennett? Yes, Wade spat. Good. We're done here. The courtroom erupted again. Ruth collapsed into her chair, shaking. Elias put his arm around her and she leaned into him. It's over, she whispered. It's over. Wade stormed out without looking back, his lawyer trailing behind trying to calm him down. Clara cheered from the gallery. Several neighbors clapped. And for the first time in 3 years, Ruth looked like she could breathe. They rode home in silence, both too exhausted to talk. When they reached the ranch, Maisie was waiting on the porch with Jericho beside her like a woolly guardian. Did we win? She called. We won, Ruth called back. Maisie whooped and ran to them, throwing her arms around Ruth's waist. I knew you would. Jericho said you would. Did he now? Elias said. Yes. He's very wise, Jericho bleated, and for the first time it sounded almost friendly. That night, after Maisie went to bed, Ruth and Elias sat on the porch under a sky full of stars. They didn't talk, didn't need to. They just sat together, hands intertwined, listening to the sounds of their land. What happens now? Ruth finally asked. Now we live, Elias said. We work the land, we raise Maisie, we build furniture and plant gardens and fix things when they break. Sounds boring. Sounds perfect. Ruth smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Yeah, it does. Spring arrived like a promise kept. The snow melted completely, the creek calmed, and the land turned green again. Ruth and Elias worked side by side, planting the expanded garden, building the workshop in the barn, repairing winter damage. Maisie grew like a weed, taller and stronger, her voice getting louder, her opinions more forceful. She bossed Jericho around like a tiny general, and the old ram tolerated her with the patience of someone who'd given up fighting years ago. Clara visited often, bringing gossip from town and supplies they couldn't make themselves. She'd stopped questioning whether Elias would stay. Somewhere along the way, she'd decided he'd earned his place. The workshop became Elias's domain. He discovered he had a talent for furniture, simple, sturdy pieces that people in town actually wanted to buy. A table here, a chair there. Small things that added up. Ruth's garden exploded with life. The tomatoes from her grandmother's seeds grew tall and thick, producing fruit that tasted like sunshine. They traded surplus vegetables for flour and sugar and coffee. Money was still tight. Would probably always be tight, but they were making it work. One evening in late April, Elias found Ruth sitting under the oak tree again. She was staring at the 2 crosses he'd carved 6 years ago, but her expression wasn't sad, just thoughtful. I come here sometimes, she said when she noticed him, to think. Elias walked over, sat beside her on the grass. About what? About how life doesn't go the way you plan. How you can lose everything and still find something worth keeping. She looked at him. Do you still miss them? Every day, Elias said honestly. But it doesn't hurt the same way anymore. He searched for words. It's part of me now. Not the only part. Not even the biggest part. Just one part of the whole. Ruth nodded slowly. I think that's how it's supposed to work. You carry what you lost, but you don't let it carry you. You let it make you stronger, more careful with what you have. They sat there as the sun set. 2 people who'd been broken in different ways, now piecing themselves back together on land that had witnessed both death and rebirth. I'm pregnant, Ruth said suddenly. Elias's heart stopped. What? I'm pregnant. About 2 months, I think. She turned to look at him, eyes searching his face for his reaction. I wasn't sure how to tell you, wasn't sure how you'd feel about it. Elias couldn't speak, couldn't move. He just stared at her, mind racing. A baby, another child, another chance to do it right. Say something, Ruth whispered. Elias pulled her close, holding her tight enough to feel her heartbeat. I'm terrified, he admitted. Me too. But I'm also... He pulled back to look at her. I'm happy. Scared out of my mind, but happy. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. Really? Really? She kissed him, soft and sweet, and Elias thought about Caroline, about Samuel, about how they would have loved this, loved Ruth, loved Maisie, loved the idea of their family continuing. They would have been happy for us, Ruth said, like she could read his thoughts. Yeah, they would have. They told Maisie a week later. She took it with the seriousness of someone being entrusted with important information. So I'm going to be a big sister? She asked. Yes, Ruth said. And I have to help take care of the baby? If you want to. Maisie considered this carefully. Will the baby be able to talk to Jericho? Probably not right away. Then I'll teach them when they're old enough. Elias smiled. That sounds perfect. Maisie ran off to tell Jericho the news, leaving Ruth and Elias alone. You think we can do this? Ruth asked quietly. I think we can try. And that's all anyone can do. The pregnancy was hard. Ruth was sick for the first few months, barely able to keep food down. Elias took over more of the household work, learning to cook simple meals and do laundry and all the things Caroline had once done without complaint. Maisie helped where she could, bringing her mother water and sitting with her during the worst days. Clara came out more often, bringing remedies and advice and a steady presence that reminded them they weren't alone. And slowly Ruth improved. The sickness faded, her energy returned, her belly swelled with new life. By summer, she was back in the garden, planting and weeding and planning for a future that now included 4 people instead of 3. Elias watched her sometimes, this woman who'd saved his land and his life, and felt gratitude so deep it hurt. The baby was born in November during the first snow, a boy, healthy and loud and perfect. They named him Samuel, after the son Elias had lost. It felt right, like bringing something full circle. Ruth held the baby, tears streaming down her face, while Maisie peered over her shoulder with wide, wondering eyes. So small, Maisie whispered. You were too once, Ruth said. Can I hold him? Sit down first. Maisie sat carefully, and Ruth placed Samuel in her arms. The little girl looked down at her brother with such fierce protectiveness that Elias felt his throat tighten. I won't let anything bad happen to him, Maisie declared. I promise. I know you won't, Elias said. That night, after everyone was asleep, Elias walked out to the oak tree. He stood between the 2 crosses and the sleeping house, caught between past and future. I did it, he said to the graves. I stayed. I built something. I have a family again. The wind rustled through the branches, carrying the scent of snow and wood smoke. I think you'd like them, Elias continued. Ruth's stubborn like you were, Caroline. And Maisie, she's got your fire. And Samuel? His voice caught. I'm going to do better this time. I promise. He stood there until the cold drove him back to the house, back to the warmth and noise and beautiful chaos of a family that needed him. 2 years passed, then 3. The ranch thrived. The workshop produced more furniture than Elias could keep up with. The garden fed them through every winter. Samuel grew from a baby into a toddler who followed Maisie everywhere, trying to copy everything she did. Maisie, now 12, had grown into a fierce, capable girl who could fix fence wire and birth lambs and negotiate with Jericho, who was now ancient and grumpy but still guarding the property like it was his life's purpose. Ruth and Elias worked side by side every day, the rhythm between them so natural it felt like they'd been doing it forever instead of just 5 years. One spring morning, Elias woke to find Ruth already up, standing in the garden with Samuel on her hip and Maisie beside her. What are you doing? He called from the porch. Planting the tomatoes, Ruth called back. Samuel wanted to help. Elias walked over and Samuel reached for him immediately. He took his son, settling the small weight against his chest, and looked at what they'd planted. Row after row of careful holes. Seeds nestled in dark earth. The promise of food and life and continuity. Think they'll grow? Maisie asked. They always do, Ruth said. That's the thing about seeds. You plant them in good soil, give them water and sun and time, and they grow, every time. She looked at Elias when she said it, and he understood. She wasn't just talking about tomatoes. She was talking about them, about what they'd planted together in soil that had once been ash and ruin, about how they'd grown anyway. That night, they sat on the porch, all 4 of them. Samuel fell asleep in Ruth's arms. Maisie leaned against Elias's shoulder, fighting sleep but losing. "You think we'll always be like this?" Maisie asked drowsily. "Like what?" Elias said. "Together. Happy." Ruth and Elias exchanged a look over the children's heads. "I think," Ruth said carefully, "that we'll have hard times. Everyone does. But I think we'll face them together, and that makes all the difference." "Promise?" Maisie said. "Promise." Satisfied, Maisie closed her eyes. Elias looked out at the valley, at the land that had almost destroyed him and then saved him, at the fences he'd mended and the house he'd rebuilt and the workshop that smelled like sawdust and possibility. And he thought about what he'd learned, that grief doesn't disappear. It just changes shape, becomes part of the foundation instead of the whole structure, that running doesn't solve anything. It just delays the reckoning, that the bravest thing you can do isn't starting over. It's staying. Staying when it's hard, staying when it hurts, staying when leaving would be easier. That love isn't always a lightning strike. Sometimes it's slow, quiet, built piece by piece through shared work and shared silence and shared determination not to quit. That family isn't just blood. It's choice. It's showing up. It's the people who stay when everyone else leaves. And that sometimes the worst thing that ever happened to you isn't the end of your story. Sometimes it's just the middle, the part where everything falls apart so something better can grow in its place. Elias Mercer had come home to bury his past. Instead, he'd found a woman who taught him that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about getting back up after you do. He'd found a little girl who reminded him that joy doesn't ask permission and love doesn't wait for perfect timing. He'd found a son who gave him a second chance to be the father he'd never gotten to be. And he'd found himself. Not the man he used to be, not the ghost he'd become, but someone new, someone scarred but whole. Someone who knew that the best things in life aren't the ones you plan for. They're the ones you fight for, build with your own hands, and protect with everything you've got. The garden Ruth planted that first year still bloomed every spring, stronger and more abundant with each passing season. The fence Elias repaired still stood strong, weathering storms and time. And the house they rebuilt together, on the bones of what had burned, became the place where two broken people learned that sometimes the most radical act of courage is simply choosing to stay, to plant seeds in scorched earth and believe they'll grow, to build on ashes and trust the foundation will hold, to love again after loss and know it might hurt but choose it anyway, because that's what it means to be alive, not to avoid pain, but to survive it, and then, impossibly, to find joy on the other side.